In all of Chapter 9, we're going to look at rational equations and expressions, and solving rational equations and simplifying rational expressions. Once again, the difference between expressions and equations is equations have an equal sign and can be solved for a value for the unknown variable. Well, rational expressions, or any expression, can only be simplified. So when you're looking at rational expressions, you can only multiply the top or divide the top and the bottom by special forms of 1 to change the way they look. So rational expressions are anything that can be written with as a fraction where it has a variable in the bottom. It may have a variable in the top, but doesn't have to. Now, we're going to go ahead and take a look at solving or simplifying something. Suppose you had 12 over 8. Most of the time you would not leave it as 12 over 8 because you know 12 is 2 times 2 times 3. 8 is 2 times 2 times 2. You know that 2 over 2 is a special form of 1. 2 over 2 is a special form of 1. So that drops out, leaving you only with the 3 over the 2. Now, in simplifying rational expressions, you can only cross out common factors like we have here, the 2's top and bottom. You cannot cross out common terms, things that are added to the top and bottom. Consider this one down here. If you have a 2 plus a 7 over 2 minus a 1, you following order of operations, you would know you get a 9 on top and you would get a 1 on the bottom. With 9 on top, 1 on the bottom, you know it simplifies down to 9. However, if you did try to go ahead and cross out the 2's here, you would not get the 9. You would get a 7 over a negative 1 or a negative 7, something totally different. So you cannot cross out things that are added to the top and the bottom. You can only cross out things that are multiplied to the top and the bottom. So let's go ahead and simplify this. And then we'll go ahead and write down when it's undefined. Well, the first step you want to do is you want to factor this. You'll notice the top is already factored, and part of the bottom is already factored. However, the second part here, its differences of squares, and that is not factored yet. So we'll have to go ahead and do that. So we get a y plus 3 and a y minus 3. Now, as we look at this, we have two things multiplied on the top, the 3y in the parentheses, and then on the bottom, you have three sets of parentheses all multiplied together. And so you can only cross out things that are the same in the top and the bottom that are multiplied. And you'll realize you can cross out the y plus 7 because they're the same on the top and the bottom, and it's a y plus 7 times the whole top and a y plus 7 times the whole bottom. So then you write what you have left. You only have a 3y on the top. You have the last two parentheses left on the bottom. This is all we're left with. We are not able to cross out these 3's right here. Because yes, in the top it's 3 times the whole top, but this 3 here is not 3 times the whole bottom. Similarly with our y's, we cannot cross them out because it's not y times the whole bottom. But you also need to go ahead and write down when is our expression undefined. When is it undefined is whenever the denominator is 0. So what you need to do is you need to look at your denominator in the factored form before you do any simplifying and decide what causes this to be 0, this to be 0, or this to be 0. Well, what causes the first one to be 0 is a negative 7. What causes this one here to be 0 is a negative 3. What causes the last one to be 0 is a positive 3. So let's look at simplifying this. Some of you may be tempted to go ahead and cross out this a cubed on the bottom with this up here and be left with only an a in the top. You could do that if it was multiplied by the whole bottom and multiplied by the whole top, but it's not, so we need to factor first. That's what you're always going to want to do with this stuff, is to factor. So you're going to factor the top, so we can pull out our common factor of an a to the fourth. Pull out your common factor on the bottom of an a cubed. Now we can go ahead and do some simplifying. Since it's an a cubed times the whole bottom and an a to the fourth times the whole top, we can simplify that, and we end up with just an a to the first power on the top. You can think of it this way. You can either subtract your exponents on your a's, or you can say which one has more a's, the top or the bottom. The top doesn't. It has one more because of the exponent. Now, when you're looking at these two parentheses, they're not identical, so you can't just cross them out and leave them alone. But since two parentheses are the same, but just switched around the minus sign, you can cross them out and put a negative 1. So you cross these out, and then you've got to put a negative 1 on top. And so you're left with nothing on the bottom, a times a negative 1 on the top, and so you get a negative a. Now you might be wondering, why can we cross these out when they're not the same? Well, let's consider this. Suppose we had 5 minus 3 on top over a 3 minus a 5. That would give us a 2 on top over a negative 2 on the bottom. 2 over negative 2 is a negative 1. Or this one here, 4 minus 8 over 8 minus 4, so you get a negative 4 on top, you get a 4 on the bottom. Negative 4 over 4 is a negative 1. Or, that works in general. Whenever they're switched around the minus sign, but everything else is the same top and bottom, but they're just flipped around the minus sign, it's always going to be a negative 1. Let's take a look over here. Let's go ahead then and just write this as one fraction, because you can multiply the tops, multiply the bottoms in multiplying fractions. Now here we can do a little bit of simplification, because you'll notice that your 8 here is a 3 cubed. You still have your 7. Your 21 is a 3 times a 7. Your 16 is your 4, or 3, if I can talk here, a 2 to the 4th power. Now that we have everything simplified as far as it can go, we can look to see what we can cross out on the top and the bottom. Now you'll notice we have a 7 on the top and a 7 on the bottom. You also notice that we have a 2 to the power on the bottom and a 2 to the power on the top. Which one has more 2's, the top or the bottom? Well, the bottom does. It has one more, so I'm going to put an exponent of 1 here, and then I'm going to cross this out up here. Also, you'll notice we have x's on the top, x's on the bottom. Which one has more x's, the top or the bottom? Well, the bottom does. That's an x to the first, that's an x cubed, so it has 2 more, so I'm going to put an exponent of 2 down there and then get rid of this on top. Also, when you take a look at the y's, you have a y squared on top, y cubed on the bottom. There's one more y in the bottom, so we're going to have a y to the first in the bottom. Now, that's also right here. So then when you look at what we have left, we don't really have anything on top. Technically, there's a 1. We still have our 3, our y to the first, our 2, and our x squared. So that 3 and the 2 give us a 6. We have our y and we have our x squared. So let's take a look at simplifying these. You may want to pause the video and go ahead and try to do these. We're going to first of all factor, so we'll pull out a common factor on the top, common factor on the bottom. These are the same but switched around the minus sign, so you can go ahead and cross those out and put a negative 1. But notice there's only a negative 1 that goes on the top. Which one has more x's, the top or the bottom? In this case, the top does. It has one more. So you're left with an x to the first on top, a negative 1 on the top, and a 1 on the bottom, which is just a negative x. Over here, you could write it as one fraction if you wanted. Then you could go ahead and factor. Notice 6 is 2 times 3, 10 is 2 times 5. Then you could start looking for common factors on the top and the bottom. You'll notice you have a 3 on the top, 3 on the bottom, they cross out. You also notice you have a 5 on the top, and a 5 on the bottom. You also have an x times an x, which is an x squared on the bottom. That should drop out your x squared on the top. You also have a y times a y, which is a y squared, which should drop out your y on top, y squared on top. We also have a z on the bottom. Now, a slightly neater version of all that is occurring here. So you're left with the z on the bottom, so we have that. Looking at what you have left on top, you have your 2 and another 2, which is 4. You then still have your y and an x cubed. Now we're going to look at dividing. Instead of dividing by a fraction, remember we always multiply by the reciprocal, and it's always the reciprocal of the second fraction. So I'm going to flip the second fraction upside down. Now it's just like the last couple of problems. Write it as one fraction, have everything factored, start crossing out the things that are the same on the top and the bottom. Now notice we have our 3's we can cross out. We have x to the first in the bottom and an x squared on top, so it leaves us with an x to the first in the top. We have an a on the bottom, simplifies our a squared on top down to an a to the first. We have our b here, that'll drop this down to a b squared on the top. Then we can go ahead and take a look at what's left, and well, then we only have our x, our a to the first, or b squared, and then we have a 2 squared and a 2 in the bottom, so that's where the 8 comes from. Same idea over here. We have a fraction divided by a fraction, so you multiply by the reciprocal of the second fraction. Now, the first fraction doesn't simplify or factor on the top or the bottom, but the second fraction does. The second fraction on the top is differences of squares, so that's going to factor into a 1 minus k and a 1 plus k. And I see there's a typo here. That's a k squared here on the bottom. The bottom's going to factor into 2 identical parentheses, so we'll factor that. Or not 2 identical, but 2 parentheses. Sorry about that. And then we want to look to see what's the same on the top and the bottom. You'll notice that you have a k plus 1 times the whole bottom and a k plus 1 times the whole top. You notice that you have a k minus 3 on the top, a k minus 3 on the bottom. Now you'll notice you have a k minus 1 and a 1 minus k. They're not the same, they're opposite of each other, so you got to cross them out and put a minus 1 on the top. So now that everything is simplified down, you look at what's left and you realize it's only a minus 1. And then we'll go ahead and do that here. To begin with, we have a fraction divided by a fraction, but remember, instead of dividing by a fraction, you multiply by the reciprocal. So now you want to make sure everything's factored in the top and the bottom. This denominator here factors. Then you want to go ahead and take a look at what's left. Crossing out your common factors, you'll notice you can cross these out and replace them with a minus 1. And then you can also simplify your x's here, and then you look at what you have left. So we take a look at the last one here. It's a fraction times a fraction, so we don't have to flip anything, but we do need to go ahead and factor this one right here. So we're going to factor the second numerator and the second denominator, because the first ones don't factor at all. We get a x plus 2 and an x plus 3 for this numerator here. Bottom one is differences of squares. Then we go ahead and take a look at what we have left. And you realize that a lot of stuff drops out. These drop. These are the same. And these are the same. So in other words, everything drops out, so you're only left with 1.